I was writing a story the other day from my personal history, and the question was, who has touched your life? What mortal, besides your family and your Providence, who has touched your life the most? And of course, my answer was Virginia Tanner. I actually didn't meet Virginia personally until I was 14 years old, which a lot of people think I was a child dancer with her, but I wasn't. But I had gone to Dr. Nephi Kazarian, who said I had some physical defects from a bout with polio, and that I needed to have these corrected. And the only person he really had faith in was Virginia Tanner, who was teaching at Wasatch School in Provo, Utah, and that my mother should take me there. So we made a switch from a teacher and went to see Virginia's concert. It was a return concert from her Children's Dance Theater tour in the East in about 1953. Boy, the years are going to rack up now. But we went to the concert, and that's the first time I saw dance in a different way. And I still remember quite a bit of it. I remember, especially I remember a dancer by the name of Lola Huth. It was a beautiful, yes. And her leaps and just the whole form was so different from what I had known in tap dancing and ballet and acrobats and all that.
The Boogie Woogie Piggy.
Yeah, the Boogie Woogie Piggy that Maida Withers and I used to teach routines. But Mother felt like it was the best thing to do. So we went over to an audition, and Virginia watched me, and I did a Boogie Woogie type dance. But she saw past that, and she saw ability, I think, and she offered me on the spot a full scholarship to her program, and the opportunity to come to Salt Lake City and study in the studio there. We took advantage of this, and it changed my life. And I lived with Virginia in the summers until I could drive, and later in my high school years. Mm-hmm. And yes, it was a definite change in my thinking, in my opinions, and where I was going to be headed for dance in my life. So there's no doubt about it. She definitely had and she taught me how to teach. And then very quickly sent me off to Perry Mansfield Theater Camp to teach children from all over the United States.
And that was in Colorado.
And that was in Colorado, and boy, I had to sink or swim. And I did figure out how to swim. So, and that's also where I met Helen Tamaris, which I think we need to remember, because before I got involved in Woman the Pioneer, Helen had come in 1947 to do the Days of 47. The church had commissioned her to come, and Virginia was her assistant. And she had put together Promise Valley. And I think some of that may have stayed in Virginia's heart and soul, because when she actually decided to do a piece, or was asked to do a piece, mm-hmm. It had all those elements from Promise Valley that she probably had worked with when she worked with Helen Tamaris. The year after I graduated from high school, which was 59, so that's fine, age. Virginia took Ruth Burke, Linda Call, and I back to the American Dance Festival in New London, Connecticut, to study from great artists. And we took a class from Pauline Kohner, Linda and I. And she told us to get some material. We were going to work with skirts. We went down to New London and just bought some material, sewed them together on the corners and slipped them over our body as skirts. I remember Virginia was in a session when we were doing an improvisation with the skirts, and I used the skirt as a cradle, rocking an imaginary baby. And Virginia said that just stayed in her mind. It touched her in such a way that she never forgot it. So that when she was given the invitation from the Seattle Symphony Orchestra Dance League to bring a group back in 1962, or up to Seattle for the World's Fair, and she had to formulate an idea. She said in the night, about 3 a.m., she had sort of a dream or an inspiration. And it was that she would do this suite in which a mother losing her baby on the plains would be the central core of the concert. And she would bring in all these other pieces, probably, as I said, influenced from Promise Valley. And it began to take shape in her mind, and this formulated into Woman the Pioneer. She then got a hold of Dr. Robert Kundick, who was the previous tabernacle organist, and she had known him in Provo because at Wasatch he had a home at one time adjacent to Wasatch School, and his two daughters studied under Virginia about the same time maybe that I was coming in. She drew us together, her most advanced students. She drew us together and told us of the invitation, and that she had this idea and that she needed us to help her. Her method of working was always to pull it from the students, give them ideas and phrases and watch what we would come up with. Consequently, in that particular process, she just said, choreograph the dance in remembrance of all the small children that died on the plains, and we'll call you Woman of Tenderness. Go do it. And so I went and did it. We took the piece to Seattle, did it at the World's Fair, and places along the way, actually. Let me mention that Theron Luke wrote the prologue and read it backstage in Seattle. Dr. Kundick had been the composer. He had the Henry Siegel Quartet, string quartet, play this with him at the piano in Seattle. In 1963, a year later, Shirley Ryrie was in charge of an orchestra's concert at the Pioneer Memorial Theater. And she wanted pieces of Totem that had been Nicolai's pieces, and also Woman the Pioneer to be performed. I get a phone call one day, probably in about January, maybe even December of 72. And then this call anyway comes from a dear beloved friend, Dee Winterton. We all loved Dee. And we had danced together at the U and then been in Repertory Dance Theater together. And he says on the phone, "Hi, Chris, how are you?" "I'm fine. I'm very pregnant with my 4th child and weary." "Well, then maybe you won't want to hear this request, but I have talked to Virginia Tanner about having you re-choreograph Woman the Pioneer for the BYU students. And she said there's no one I would trust better than Chris to do it. So what do you think of that?" And I am thinking,
You and Dee were
no.
very good friends. You
Yes.
probably gave him
Yes.
a very
I
feisty
thought,
answer.
I do not think I'm up to this. But at that moment, and I have to say, at that moment, it was almost as if I felt a pair of hands on my shoulders, pressing on my shoulders, and the thought, this is your work. And I had to pay attention to that. So I said, I will. And I met with Virginia, and Virginia met with Bob, and we only had a cassette with the Woman the Pioneer music on it. And she could only find 5 photographs. Now, after her death, Bruce found a slew of photographs. But for me, there were 5 photographs and a cassette.
And your embodied memory.
And my embodied muscle memory. And also watching the dances, other people's movements. I remembered Julie Whittaker's themes for Joy. And so I set about the task, and it was difficult. But I was blessed. Our first performance was in '74, but before the performance, Theron Luke, Dee Winterton, Virginia Tanner, maybe some parents, came to the Richards building to see the work in progress that just barely got finished and see if she could put her seal of approval on it. And they were all sitting up there in the Richards building
In the
balcony.
old Richards building where there was that big balcony.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was there too, and I was just watching the whole thing unfold as you dancers perform this to your heart's content, and in old long skirts and old costumes, you know, the whole bit. And after it was all through, I looked over and Virginia was weeping. And she turned to me and she said, "Chris, that's just how I remember it." And I thought, how could it be the way you remember it?
Because it's not the
It's
same.
not the way I remember it. But it was, she said, you caught the spirit. And she put her seal of approval on that. And as the years have gone by, you and I have been true to that, as you've helped me to choreograph and recall. Maybe the choreography hasn't been the most detailed or the most wonderful choreography. Maybe it's simplistic and dated. But since Virginia put her seal on that, that's the way we've done it. It was definitely a sharing of everyone who, in the first cast, the 1962 cast, and also the 1973-4 cast. We actually invited Marianne to come down, and Nancy Welty and Tina Masaka. Remember, we had them come down from Salt Lake and fill in, and then we took the piece back up to celebrate Virginia's 25th anniversary of the Children's Dance Theater, and another time that we did it, besides the 1986 performance that Marianne had us come and do. The piece itself began, it was, and if you remember, I was going to say it held its own. It was the most performed piece in probably all through the 80s, probably the late 70s and 80s, and even somewhat at BYU, taken out of state into India by Dancers Company, into Mexico Dancers Company, and bits and pieces repeated here and there for years. I keep remembering every day that it was Virginia's concept, and I have been true to her, true to Virginia as a caretaker. Not to say it was mine, really, but it is so much of me. There's something about the piece. It's an inspired piece. Virginia was inspired. It has a legacy now in its history that we can't dismiss.